A Canadian Muslim of Indian descent, Dr. Shadaab Rahemtullah is lecturer in Islamic and Christian Muslim relations at the School of Divinity, University of Edinburgh. Shadaab did his undergraduate and master's degrees in Middle Eastern and Islamic history at Simon Fraser University and a master's in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations at the University of Toronto. He then completed his PhD in Islamic thought at the University of Oxford. Shadaab's primary interest lies in the relationship between religion, power, and resistance, exploring how religious texts can be interpreted and reinterpreted to challenge structures of social domination, including poverty and patriarchy, racism, and empire. He is the author of the book Qur'an of the Oppressed, Liberation Theology and Gender Justice in Islam, published by Oxford University Press. Before joining the University of Edinburgh, Shadaab taught at the University of Jordan in Amman for 6 years.
Much for this opportunity. I'm really thankful for this chance to share some of my research. And I'm very excited to be participating at something with the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies because, as Aslam mentioned, I studied at SFU for a good number of years. So I'm very much vested in any type of work that has to do with Islam in Vancouver in general, but at SFU in particular. Can everyone see my screen? Aslam, give me a thumbs up. Great. When talking about human rights, we tend to see religion as something that's restrictive, as something that's a problem, that's oppressive, that gets in the way of human liberation. That assumption has been challenged by a movement called liberation theology. In a nutshell, liberation theology raises a question. When we talk about religion, whose religion are we talking about? Are we talking about the religion of the powerful or the oppressed? Religion, as interpreted by the powerful, will always come in the way of justice. It will be an establishment faith, a theology of the status quo. Liberation theology moves in the opposite direction. It moves in the direction of the margins of society. Focusing on the contexts of the poor and the marginalized, liberation theology reinterprets religion as a tool to challenge oppression, as a tool to speak truth to power. So that's what liberation theology is all about. But this lecture isn't an intro to liberation theology. It's much more specific than that. This lecture addresses a critique coming from indigenous circles of a popular paradigm within Christian liberation theology. I'm going to begin by outlining that critique. So I'm going to paint a picture for you, and then I'm going to provide an Islamic perspective focusing on the Qur'an. I'm going to conclude by relating all of this to Islam and human rights. Theology is how we conceive of God. And the conception of God, the nature of God, is absolutely central to liberation theology. God is conceptualized as utterly just. In fact, not only is God just, but God is in solidarity with the oppressed and at war with their oppressor. This is a deity who refuses to remain neutral in a context of oppression. This is a deity who actively and unapologetically chooses the weaker side. And for liberation theologians, that preferential choice is best captured in the Exodus, in the liberation of the ancient Israelites from Pharaoh. This is a God who witnesses the suffering of the Israelites under Pharaoh's brutal regime and who supports their liberation. Through the prophetic leadership of Moses and countless miracles / divine acts of resistance, God allows the Israelites to escape Egyptian bondage. The Exodus paradigm emerged right from the beginning of liberation theology back in the 60s. You can see it in the work of leading Latin American liberation theologians such as Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru and Leonardo Boff in Brazil. You can also see it in the Black theology of James Cone in the USA. Black theology emerged within the African American community in the 60s, and it reread Christianity in the context of white supremacy. Given the American context of slavery, the Exodus naturally became a central theme, a central motif in Black theology, emphasizing a just God who is in solidarity with the enslaved and at the same time at war with their slave drivers. So the Exodus was there right from the beginning of liberation theology, and it continues to be an influential paradigm to this day. But the Exodus paradigm has also been critiqued by indigenous scholars, specifically the Native American Robert Warrior and the Palestinian Edward Said. They approach the story from a very different perspective, as members of indigenous communities who have been and who continue to be oppressed by settler colonial regimes. In the case of Warrior, the US; in the case of Said, the State of Israel. Warrior and Said argue that if you read the Exodus story through quote-unquote Canaanite eyes, this story isn't about liberation or freedom. That would be a rather selective reading. The Exodus story is also about conquest and dispossession. Specifically, they point to the Israelite conquest of Canaan. According to the biblical narrative, God instructs the liberated Israelites who have now left Egypt to take the promised land, the land of Canaan, and to destroy the indigenous inhabitants. Quote, "In the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded." Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 to 17. So in the narrative, this isn't just a massacre. It's a divinely sanctioned massacre. This is what the God of Israel wants. This is what he demands from his quote-unquote chosen people. The book of Joshua records how the Israelite forces sacked one city after another, wiping out the indigenous inhabitants. Once this process of destruction is complete, the 12 tribes, under Joshua's leadership, divide the land between them, with 9.5 tribes, quote-unquote, inheriting in the west bank of the River Jordan, and 2.5 tribes, quote-unquote, inheriting in the east bank. So Warrior's and Said's critique is not some marginal criticism. It's a major challenge to the Exodus paradigm. It exposes a glaring contradiction within it. And this contradiction has theological consequences, as the God of the oppressed now becomes, in effect, the God of the oppressor. So the very heart of liberation theology, the nature of God as being just, was shaken vis-a-vis this critique. It shook the whole paradigm. The conquest of Canaan has also had colonial implications. This narrative has been used to justify European empire and genocide throughout the world, such as in South America in the 16th century, South Africa in the 18th century, and occupied Palestine in the 21st century. It says something that the first epic poem written in the American colonies was called, quote, "The Conquest of Canaan," composed by Reverend Timothy Dwight, who would later become president of Yale. The poem portrays England as Pharaoh, the American colonies as Israel, and the indigenous inhabitants as, quote, "wolfish, fiendish Canaanites," end quote. And this is where I come in as a Muslim liberation theologian. The Exodus has also been a key paradigm in Islamic liberation theology, such as in the pioneering work of Farid Isaac in South Africa. Indeed, in the Qur'an as a whole, Moses and the Israelites are major protagonists. The text devotes an extensive amount of space to the Israelite prophets, and Moses is actually the most mentioned prophet in the Qur'an. Conversely, Pharaoh is the most vilified human figure in the Quranic text, embodying oppression and injustice. But going back to Warrior and Said's critique of the Exodus, I couldn't help but wonder, what does the Qur'an itself have to say about the conquest of Canaan? Does it mirror the biblical narrative? Are the Israelites instructed to attack the indigenous inhabitants? Did a mass genocide take place? And if so, was this genocide divinely sanctioned? In sum, is the Exodus paradigm used in a Muslim liberative context also a contradiction? Is it also problematic? These are the research questions that framed my study of the Qur'an. Having gone through the text, this lecture presents my findings. Firstly, the word Canaan or Canaan in Arabic, the word Canaan doesn't appear in the Qur'an. The Qur'an simply uses the term the Holy Land, al-Ard al-Muqaddasa. It's not a major point, but language matters, and so that's the terminology that I'll use. Secondly, and more significantly, there's a critical difference in the Quranic representation of the Holy Land as, quote, promised land. In the Old Testament, God makes an explicit primordial promise to Abraham. He says that he will give the land of Canaan to Abraham's offspring. Book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 5 to 7. At a later point in Genesis, God repeats this promise to Abraham, but this time he describes a considerably larger stretch of land, extending, quote, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, end quote. Genesis 15, verses 17 to 18. And that's why the Israelites, as the children of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, refer to Canaan as the promised land. So this is a primordial promise made to a group as a group, the Israelites as Israelites. Ibrahim, is also a major figure in the Qur'an, and Allah has a lot to say about this prophet. Abraham is constantly praised as a beloved servant, a devout prophet, a paragon of faith. In fact, Abraham's title is Khalilullah, the friend of Allah. But nowhere in the Qur'an is Abraham promised the Holy Land. Instead, Allah vows to make Abraham a leader, an imam of humankind. And when Abraham asks if this promise extends to his offspring, Allah clarifies that it will only include those who are not oppressors, al-Zalimin, chapter 2, verse 124. So in the Qur'an, there is no primordial Abrahamic promise made to the Israelites as a group. There's no promise made to the Israelites as Israelites. The Quranic statements concerning land are all addressed to a context of oppression in a particular historical moment, specifically Pharaonic domination and Israelite suffering. So it's not simply the Israelites, but the fleeing Israelites, the battered Israelites, who are assured that the land is, quote, written, kataba, for them. Chapter 28, verses 5 to 6, are a classic example of such a statement. This is probably the most influential scriptural passage in Islamic liberation theology. You can see it in the South African liberation theology of Farid Issaaq. Sherman Jackson is a leading scholar of Islamic Black theology, and this verse prefaces both of his books on Black theology, Islam and the Black American and Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering. Quote, "It is our will to bestow our grace upon the downtrodden of the earth, and to make them the leaders, and to make them the inheritors of the earth, and to establish them securely on the earth, and to let Pharaoh and Haman and their hosts experience through them, the Israelites, the very thing against which they sought to protect themselves." End quote. And now we get to the third, and perhaps the most significant point. The conquest of Canaan doesn't exist in the Qur'an. Like the primordial promise made to Abraham, the conquest of Canaan is a distinctly biblical notion. The Qur'an actually has very little to say about the Israelite encounter with the Holy Land. There's a silence to the text. We're basically given two snapshots of that encounter. The first snapshot is found in chapter 5, verses 20 to 26. This takes place shortly after the Exodus. The Israelites have escaped Pharaoh's Egypt. They've spent time at Mount Sinai. They've received the revelations, and they've journeyed on to the edge of the Holy Land. At this point, Allah instructs them to enter the land, and the Israelites refuse. They discern that a mighty people inhabit the land, and they adamantly refuse to enter it. Allah is enraged, and He punishes them by making them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Quote, "When Moses said to his people, 'O my people, enter the Holy Land which God has written for you, and do not turn your backs, or you will become losers,' they said, 'O Moses, they are a mighty people in it. We will not enter it until they leave it, but once they leave it, we will go in.' They said, 'O Moses, we will never enter it so long as they remain in it. Go ahead, you and your Lord, and fight. We will be sitting right here.' He, Moses, said, 'My Lord, I have no power over anyone except myself and my brother, so part us from the transgressing lot.' He, God, said, 'It shall be forbidden them for 40 years. They shall wander about in the earth, so do not grieve for the transgressing lot." End quote. Now, at first glance, this Quranic snapshot sounds very similar to the narrative of the spies found in the Old Testament, specifically in the book of Numbers. In the Old Testament narrative, the Israelites are ordered to invade Canaan and attack the indigenous inhabitants. But after observing the strength of the indigenous inhabitants, the Israelites are filled with fear and refuse God's command. And as a result, they're condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But it's important to look at the actual wording of the Qur'an. What precisely does the text say? This is the command that Moses gives to the Israelites. Ya qawmi, udkhulu al-ard al-muqaddasa. O my people, enter the Holy Land. Note that the language here is simply one of entrance. Udkhulu, enter, is the imperative form of the noun dukhul, entrance. Entrance, in and of itself, doesn't carry connotations of violence. Furthermore, the notion of fighting, qital, is introduced by the Israelites, not by Allah or Moses. Here is how the Israelites respond to Moses, quote, "O Moses, we will never enter it so long as they remain in it. Go ahead, you and your Lord, and fight. فَإِذْهَبْ أَنْتَ وَرَبُّكَ فَقَاتِلَا. We will be sitting right here." Chapter 5, verse 24. In other words, the Israelites make a critical assumption. They assume that entering the land must entail attacking the indigenous inhabitants of that land. To enter is to attack and vice versa. But the Quranic text makes no such equation. It makes no such assumption. It simply commands the Israelites to enter, udkhul. Essentially, this passage is a test of faith. Allah is ordering the Israelites to enter the land in full view of the manifest strength of its inhabitants. Do the Israelites genuinely believe in Allah? Do they genuinely believe in Allah's protection, given all the miracles they've already seen him, her perform in Egypt? The locals of the land are clearly strong, but why should such strength translate into something negative? That is to say, why should such strength lead to antagonism and hostility? Why are such assumptions being made about the indigenous other in the first place? Perhaps the locals will welcome the Israelites, battered slaves fleeing authoritarian Egypt, and offer hospitality, taking them into their homes and giving them sanctuary. So that's the first assumption that the Israelites make, that entrance, dukhul, is synonymous with fighting, qital. But they also make another key assumption. They assume that only one group can live in the land, an ascendant group, a dominating group. The possibility of actually co-inhabiting the land, the indigenous people as the respected locals, they as sanctuaried refugees and migrants, that possibility is inconceivable in their us versus them thinking. To put it another way, the Israelites assume that since the land is written for them, it must only be written for them. The land cannot be. Notice how binary and dichotomous their thinking is. Quote, we will not enter it until they leave it, but once they leave it, we will go in. And again, quote, we will never enter it so long as they remain in it. Go ahead, you and your Lord, and fight. فَإِذْهَبْ أَنْتَ وَرَبُّكَ فَقَاتِلَا. So that's the first Quranic snapshot. It's a test of faith, and the Israelites fail the test. As punishment, they're condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. This brings us to the second snapshot. This snapshot fast forwards into the future, to the Israelites' actual entry into the Holy Land 40 years later. This snapshot is captured in two Quranic passages that are almost identical. Chapter 2, verses 58 to 59, and chapter 7, verses 161 to 162. Here is the wording of the first passage. Quote, and when we said, enter this town, and eat freely when you wish, and enter at the gate prostrating, and say, relief, that we may forgive your mistakes, and we will increase the doers of good. But those who oppressed changed the words with other than what they were told. So we sent down on those who oppressed a punishment from the sky because of the transgressions they used to commit. Chapter 2, verses 58 to 59. In this snapshot, there are a number of themes that stand out. A, the Israelites are not commanded anywhere in the passage to attack the local inhabitants. They're not commanded anywhere in the passage to attack the local inhabitants. Just like the first snapshot, the Arabic verb that is used is udkhulu, enter. In the case of chapter 7, verses 161 to 162, the verb that is used is uskunu, dwell in the land. The noun form of uskunu is sukun, living, dwelling. And it's worth noting that sukun also means tranquility, to attain peace of mind. That's where the names Sukaina and Sakina come from. Clearly, none of these terms carry any connotations of violence. B, the Israelites are ordered to enter the gate prostrating, sujjadan, and to ask for relief and forgiveness. In other words, according to the Qur'an, the Israelite entry into the Holy Land is meant to be humble and pious and meek. This is a very different image from the triumphalist parade of an arrogant conquering force. This isn't the entrance of an imperial soldier, but a humble servant. C, the snapshot tells us that a group of Israelites apparently changed God's words and acted in an oppressive manner. They're explicitly referred to in the passage as, quote, those who oppressed, alladhina zalamu. What exactly they said and did, we don't know. There's a silence to the text. But their actions were so severe that they resulted in a swift punishment from the heavens. So this is what the Qur'an itself has to say about the Israelite encounter with the Holy Land. Nowhere in the text does God command the Israelites to attack the indigenous people. Clearly, the Quranic account is very different from the Old Testament one, in which God commands the Israelites to destroy the local inhabitants, to, quote, save alive nothing that breathes. To go back to Warrior and Saeed's critique, the Exodus paradigm clearly has problems in terms of Christian liberation theology. There's a manifest contradiction between the Israelite liberation from Egypt on the one hand and the Israelite genocide of the Canaanites on the other. Warrior and Saeed's critique was a major setback for liberation theology, and rightly so. It was a sound anti-colonial critique. But as I've shown, that contradiction doesn't exist in the Quranic account. Read through Canaanite eyes, the Quranic Exodus holds. That is to say, the account is compatible with anti-colonial politics. with a political commitment to opposing empire, especially settler colonialism. And that, I argue, is a progressive development not only for Islamic liberation theology, but for liberation theology as a whole. I want to conclude this lecture with a point of clarification and a point of significance. Let's start with the clarification. My aim in this talk is not to deliver a polemic against the Bible, and at the same time to conveniently put my own scripture as a Muslim on a pedestal, to show how great and how pristine the Qur'an really is. On the contrary, as a Muslim, I've been deeply inspired by the Bible, in particular, the Gospels. Let me give you a concrete example. Like many Muslims around the world, every Ramadan, I read the whole Qur'an, front to back, a juz'a a day. And this past Ramadan, I decided to be a naughty Muslim and to read the New Testament instead. So I divided it into 30 parts and read one part for each night of Ramadan. Without question, this was one of the most fulfilling Ramadans I have ever had. Through the Gospels, I felt a deep sense of connection to my prophet, Jesus, son of Mary, Isa ibn Maryam, and especially his unfledgling commitment to the poor, the neglected, and the outcast of his society. In terms of following Prophet Jesus' sunnah as a Muslim, it was the gospel accounts that showed me the way. But while this lecture is not a polemic, it also shows how problematic the relationship can be between the Bible and the Qur'an. For the Bible has profoundly shaped historic Muslim understandings of their scripture. Despite the fact that the conquest of Canaan doesn't exist in the Qur'an, it is taken as a given in the Tafsir tradition, in the 1,000-year-old tradition of Quranic commentary. You can see the conquest in the Tafsir of Abu Ja'far al-Tabari in the 9th century, the Tafsir of Ismail ibn Kathir in the 14th century. You can see it in the Tafsir Jalalain, the Tafsir of the two Jalals, Jalal ad-Din al-Mahalli and his student Jalal ad-Din al-Suyuti in the 14th and 15th centuries. You can even see the conquest of Canaan in modern commentaries like the Tafsir of Abu al-A'la Maududi in Pakistan. And the conquest of Canaan is there in the Tafsir tradition because all these commentators drew on biblical literature, what we would call Israeliyat in Islamic studies. All of these commentators drew on biblical literature when interpreting the Qur'an. So At-Tabari interprets chapter 5, verses 20 to 6. Remember, that's the first Quranic snapshot. He interprets that as, quote, the command of God to fight the mighty people. Amar Allah fi qital al-jabbarin, and to attack them in their land. وَهُجُومِهِمْ عَلَيْهِمْ فِي أَرْضِهِمْ. Tafsir At-Tabari, volume 3, page 67. That's how At-Tabari interprets it. Even though the words qital, fighting, and hujum, attack, are never used in the Quranic text. So that's the first point. While this is no polemic, clearly, when it comes to indigenous rights, the biblical account is problematic in a way that the Quranic one isn't. We can actually reconcile a commitment to indigenous rights with the Quranic account. And this brings me to my last and final point, the point of significance. Here I want to zoom out and relate this lecture to the larger field of Islam and human rights. When you look at what's being written in the field, there's a strong emphasis on certain categories. In terms of women, gender, and sexuality in Islam, we now have an extensive and sophisticated body of scholarship. We also have a lot of good work on religious pluralism and interfaith dialogue in Islam, and these are important developments. We need even more critical scholarship on gender and pluralism in Islam. But there are also categories of oppression that have been neglected. Class and race have received very little attention, and so has the question of indigenous rights. To clarify, there's been extensive scholarship on occupied Palestine and Islamic resistance movements, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so forth. And there's also been extensive critical scholarship on Western empire in the Muslim world. But the problem of settler colonialism itself as a category hasn't been theologically engaged. The dispossession of indigenous peoples as a category hasn't been addressed. Let me give my own example. I grew up in Vancouver in the 1990s and 2000s, and I grew up in a very devout Muslim household. The Muslim community held tons of events for Palestine, and rightly so. But in my experience, I know times have changed and things have moved on, but in my experience in the 90s and 2000s, not once did we hold an event for the indigenous peoples of the land, the Coast Salish peoples. We didn't acknowledge as a faith community that we live on unceded, stolen Coast Salish territory. And for those of you joining us from outside Vancouver/Coast Salish territories, here you can see that Coast Salish lands cut across the settler colonies of Canada in the north and the United States in the south. Or rather, to put it more precisely, the settler colonies of the United States and Canada cut across Coast Salish territories. As a result of Canadian settler colonialism and decades of institutionalized racism, the Indigenous peoples of Canada are now the poorest and most vulnerable group in the country, especially Indigenous women. And the same can be said of the Indigenous peoples of the United States and Australia, both of which have large and established Muslim communities. But Indigenous peoples weren't on our Islamic radar, despite all our social justice work for Palestine. And that's what I mean when I say that settler colonialism and indigenous rights as categories haven't received attention in Islamic discourse. And this is the larger contribution of this lecture. The conquest of Canaan is perhaps the biggest scriptural challenge that anti-colonial Jewish and Christian theologians have had to address. By engaging the representation of Canaan in my own scripture, I've tried to start a conversation about First Nations rights in Islam, about what it means to be a devout Muslim in a settler colonial context. Thank you.